It's been 10 years since San Antonio, Texas mother Maureen Molak lost her youngest son. The grieving mom puts the blame on big tech.
I lost my 16-year-old son, David, to suicide after a year-long battle with social media and online gaming addiction. With the last 3 months of his life, he was the target of cyberbullying by a group of classmates at his school.
She's been pushing for accountability ever since, coming to D.C. more than a dozen times. Molak was surrounded by other parents outside the Capitol with similar tragic stories.
Congress moves so slow and technology moves so fast, but time is up. And there are more children dying every day.
The Kids Online Safety Act has been stalled on Capitol Hill. First introduced in 2022, it looks to mandate safeguards that social media companies have to put into place for minors. Even with strong bipartisan support, the bill hasn't moved.
Our children are worth protecting, and that we need protections in the virtual space the same as we have in the physical space.
When parents ask you, what's the holdup, why hasn't anything happened yet, what do you tell them?
The holdup is the enormous sway that big tech continues to have in the United States Congress. If we can break the hold of big tech on Congress, we'll get KOSA done.
Just a pro tip, whenever you see Amy Klobuchar, Ted Cruz, Marsha Blackburn, and Richard Blumenthal team up for something, it's a sign that they're probably doing something very bad, and that is indeed the case with regard to this particular issue. Now, the news clip that you just watched paints a picture of ideologically opposed U.S. senators putting aside their political differences for a noble cause, to take on big tech to protect America's youth from predatory social media giants. And chances are, other news outlets that are talking about this are covering it in a similar way, that is, if they're talking about this at all. But there were some red flags that I'm sure most of you noticed. First of all, Marsha Blackburn was feigning concern about the safety of children when she doesn't want to do anything about mass shooters gunning them down in their classrooms on a near monthly basis. And she said, oh, well, we should protect them online like we do in real life. But you're not doing that, sweetie, so who's the we in this particular situation? Moreover, why is Richard Blumenthal pretending to be an opponent to big tech when he voted for the TikTok ban at the behest of its competitors like Meta, who are lobbying for that TikTok ban? See, it doesn't quite add up, and all of these red flags exist because these people are completely full of shit. In fact, the entire premise of the so-called Kids Online Safety Act is false, because in practice, it'll give the government unconstitutional powers to police internet usage for everyone, not just children. And these politicians are exploiting grieving parents to enact Orwellian internet censorship laws that they will undoubtedly use for nefarious purposes. And unfortunately, the House is probably going to vote to give themselves that exact power next week, because the Energy and Commerce Committee announced bipartisan agreement on the Kids Online Safety Act, the very law that they were talking about, which includes provisions from 14 different internet-based bills that would collectively do a number of things. Notably, as Punchbowl News reports, it'd require age verification for adult websites and, quote, require platforms such as Instagram to have procedures for curbing harm to young people, and mandates that social apps maximize safety settings for minors by default. It also puts constraints on features like disappearing messages. Oh goody, so the government's going to have a permanent record of everything that we privately say, even on encrypted apps. Awesome. Now, on its face, I think most people might not have that much issues with some of the things there, but I can assure you that lawmakers are not proposing this out of concern for children, because ironically, this bill would actually harm the most vulnerable children, because what is and isn't harmful to minors is entirely subjective. Republicans, for example, would argue that websites with resources about abortion are harmful to minors because they shouldn't be able to access information about abortion without parental consent. I would argue that pregnant teens may actually need resources provided by these websites, especially if they don't feel safe telling their parents, who are either fundamentalist or abusive, that they need an abortion because they were raped. Republicans would also argue that LGBTQ plus resources provided by the Trevor Project are harmful to minors, and I would say, actually, it's life-saving. Because if you are a young queer person who lacks a support system at home, being able to talk to somebody who can act as a counselor or a mentor could be life-saving. And this isn't hypothetical. I'm not just making up these things because I don't like the bill. Fight for the Future explains the Screen Act and other age verification bills like this didn't come out of nowhere. They've been passed already in states like Kansas and South Dakota, where acts of homosexuality are now legally considered harmful to minors and eligible for censorship. The push to adopt online ID checks to protect kids is textbook right-wing censorship led by groups who consider queer and trans people a danger to children and worthy targets for surveillance and censorship. Enforcement of the Screen Act would fall to Trump's FTC chair, Andrew Ferguson, who conveniently promised to fight back against the trans agenda if nominated. And yes, the Screen Act is included in the slate of bills absorbed by the Kids Online Safety Act. So in effect, it would open the door to nationwide LGBTQ+ censorship on the internet, which is something that one of the co-sponsors of the Kids Online Safety Act has actually admitted. So just listen to Marsha Blackburn talk about how the legislation that she penned with Democrat Richard Blumenthal would be used to protect kids from big trans.
Protecting minor children from the transgender and this culture and that influence. And I would add to that, watching what's happening on social media. And I've got the Kids Online Safety Act that I think we're going to end up getting through probably this summer. This would put a duty of care and responsibility on the social media platforms. And this is where children are being indoctrinated. They're hearing things at school, and then they're getting onto YouTube to watch a video, and all of a sudden this comes to them. And they're on Snapchat or they're on Instagram, and they click on something, and the next thing you know, they're being inundated with it. Parents need to be watching this, teachers need to be watching, and protecting our children and making certain that they are not exposed to things that they are emotionally not mature enough to handle.
So you heard it straight from the horse's mouth. This is going to be a tool used by social conservatives to force their Christian nationalist agenda on everybody. The question is, why are so many Democrats going along with this if they know how Republicans are going to weaponize it? It's not like they're ignorant. Republicans are basically saying, this is what we're going to use this for, and Republicans in red states who have passed similar bills are using it in the exact way they're saying they're going to use it. So why are Democrats doing this? And the answer is complicated, but the TLDR is that Democrats also want to censor the internet as well. They just want to censor different things than Republicans. And this is going to give all lawmakers the tool to censor things that they don't want. Although, to be fair, the Democrats who support this have introduced various amendments and iterated on the original bill to address concerns from LGBTQ+ organizations like GLAAD, who said, hey, this can be used for nefarious purposes. And once they created these amendments and tweaked the bill, those organizations dropped their opposition to KOSA, I should say. The newer versions, though, did not fundamentally change the structure of the bill. It just made it so that way Republican attorneys general had to jump through additional hoops if they did want to censor queer content online. But they'd still be able to do that even with the new versions if they really wanted to. And every subsequent version carries that same exact risk, including this one, which I will link to down below if you want to read it in full. Mandating the maximization of safety as a default for all websites could foster an environment where websites just feel pressure to suppress queer content so that way they can appease Donald Trump, because if they don't, he'll accuse them of caving to the mob and he could harm them. We see how a bunch of companies are bending over backwards to appease this fascist regime. But the Democrats who are championing this, they very clearly think that it's worth the cost because they know about the risks. But again, like Republicans, there are some viewpoints that they also don't want us to have access to online. Some senators that voted to ban TikTok, they admitted that they did that because they thought TikTok was making Americans too anti-Israel because there were so many pro-Palestinian voices on the app. So Democratic lawmakers, they also want to be able to have the power to slap age verification on websites that they don't like, because that's kind of just like the way that a lot of governments, including neoliberal governments, are going. But if you think I'm catastrophizing too much or being too uncharitable, let's just assume for argument's sake that age verification will only be used as it's intended, to stop kids from accessing pornographic material online. Just think about how that's going to be enforced in practice. Adults are going to be forced to prove their age and verify that either by submitting biometric data or uploading a photograph of their driver's license. In other words, in order to stop kids from accessing this content, you have to police the internet usage of adults. And that is a serious civil liberties violation because adults shouldn't have to get permission from the government to jack off by uploading a picture of their ID to some unsecured database in order to just watch porn. That is a basic freedom that we should all have, regardless if some social conservatives think that it's immoral. And ask yourself why so many red states have already enacted these kinds of laws. Because they are run by Christian nationalist Republicans who think that porn is a sin. Banning porn was a goal of Project 2025 after all, and age verification laws are de facto porn bans, which aligns perfectly with their Christian nationalist agenda. But the problem is that this is no longer just seen as a Christian nationalist fundamentalist sort of thing. More people are coming around to the idea of age verification because they believe that it really does protect children, when in actuality, it would not protect children. Okay, as I talked about earlier, it would harm children, in particular children from marginalized communities. But in countries where age verification has already been implemented, like the UK, children are still able to easily bypass them. But if they can't bypass them, then there's a potential that they'll find themselves on some shadier website that doesn't comply with federal laws. And that website could be even more dangerous. And I mean, if I'm a parent, I wouldn't want my kid to have access to any porn, of course, but I sure wouldn't want them to find it on the dark web. But another question is, which third party gets to store all of our personal information? I don't think they have that sorted out yet. In fact, a lot of governments, they pass a law before they even decide who gets to collect this information. But I, for one, don't feel comfortable with companies like Palantir getting access to even more of Americans' personal information. But putting aside the efficacy of age verification laws, regardless of how you feel about them or whether or not they work, they're just blatantly unconstitutional, full stop. The Electronic Frontier Foundation writes, courts around the country have confirmed that it is nearly impossible to impose online age verification requirements on social media platforms, general purpose websites, or app stores without violating internet users' First Amendment rights. Courts are blocking different iterations of these so-called child safety proposals enacted by states. Laws that lock such broad swaths of online content behind age gates can almost never withstand First Amendment scrutiny because they violate all internet users' rights to access information, impinge on people's right to anonymity, and exacerbate their data and security risks. Courts have repeatedly rejected lawmakers' justification that these laws are necessary to protect young people from harmful content online. Courts have ruled that social media platforms contain vast quantities of constitutionally protected speech, even as to minors. States have not been able to provide courts with conclusive evidence that establishes a clear causal relationship between minor social media usage and negative mental health impacts. And courts have confirmed that minors have substantial First Amendment rights to speak online and access others' online speech. And the reason why so many courts, excluding the Supreme Court, of course, since they're an entirely different beast, have erred on the side of caution when it comes to age verification is because there's not really a way to selectively restrict speech for minors without chilling it for everybody else. And even if you could do that, courts have also found that minors have free speech protections online too, so it would be unconstitutional. But that's what lawmakers have been trying to do for a very long time. Section 230, for example, of the 1996 Communications Act has increasingly become a target for lawmakers on both sides of the aisle, including Donald Trump, mind you, because they also want to be able to censor speech that they don't like. And if Section 230 were to ever be repealed, that would be devastating because that is foundational to free speech on the internet because it shields websites from legal culpability for things that people say on their platforms. And that is important because if somebody posted a YouTube video, for example, defaming somebody, only the person who created that defamatory video would be liable, not YouTube itself. And this has been framed as immunity for tech giants by pro-censorship lawmakers, but it is necessary because it allows regular people to have free speech on these platforms at all. Because think about what the internet would look like if Section 230 were to get repealed. Websites would have a strong financial incentive to drastically reduce what everybody says on their platform because if they didn't aggressively police speech, they could be legally liable for things people say and do on their websites. And as it stands now, I'm the only one responsible for shit that I say on this platform, not Google. If I say something defamatory or out of pocket, I'm the one who's on the hook for it, not Google. But if Section 230 went the way of the dodo and Google was legally liable for things that I say, they might not want to give me or anyone else as much freedom as we currently have to say the shit that we say. Like, even if we comply with their terms of service, like I do, it's still a risk, if Section 230 were gone, to have millions of people every single day on their website saying shit that could get them sued. The money that creators bring in for them through ad revenue and whatnot would be peanuts compared to the money that they'd have to spend every single time they got sued for something that somebody else said on their platform. There are millions of people on this platform, so the potential there would be endless. And in that environment, only the most vanilla, corporate-friendly content would be allowed on the platform. But that is the exact reason why people in power want to destroy Section 230, because they want to silence people who challenge the status quo. And it's important to talk about Section 230 in the context of KOSA, by the way, because if KOSA passes, then Section 230 is going to be the next domino to fall directly after that. Now, thankfully, Section 230 isn't being targeted in the latest iteration of KOSA, which is awesome. I'll cross my fingers that doesn't change. But it's also the target of grieving parents who claim that their children were harmed by things on YouTube. And that's what makes censorship so compelling to some people, because you can't just disregard what a grieving parent says. If they say that social media killed their kid, then people are going to be inclined to believe that. So a lot of people might be receptive to that argument because they view censorship as a necessary evil to protect children. And, seeing as how evil big tech companies like Meta and Twitter are, it's easy to see why so many more people are sympathetic to a policy that was historically only pushed by social conservatives. But you have to disaggregate social media from the big tech companies that we all despise. Even though it's reasonable to hate social media companies like Meta because of the way that they design their algorithms, that doesn't necessarily mean that social media itself is inherently bad. And as much as I hate Twitter and Facebook, YouTube, which is also considered a social media website, even if Google argues that it's not in court, is the one place that I can go to find content that is cathartic and validating. I'll admit, I also really enjoy short-form content on Instagram and TikTok sometimes, but it just depends. Overall, though, social media is a mixed bag. And even though we'll often hear about the harm social media causes to young people, the science isn't as conclusive as media leads you to believe. A summary of a meta-analysis from Yale Medicine contends that social media itself can actually be really beneficial to teens. It allows them to foster connections with people outside of their own communities that they wouldn't otherwise meet in real life. It gives them an outlet for self-expression, and most teens self-report that social media actually makes them feel more accepted and helps them get through tough times, which is especially probably true for teens who are from marginalized groups. That's not to say that it can't be harmful, but the negative mental health outcomes are typically more persistent in teens who overuse social media. But in moderation, there could be a plethora of benefits to social media, which is why it doesn't really make sense to enact sweeping draconian restrictions on all of social media. It's like requiring age verification to watch TV because your kids could theoretically stumble across violent shows. It wouldn't make sense to do that. And while I feel horrible for the parents that we heard from at the beginning of this video, the reality is that the solutions that they've been sold would do more harm than good. And while I'm not, minimizing potential harms caused by social media, there are other underlying political issues not being addressed that are also contributing to the declining mental health of America's youth. But social media is an easy scapegoat because the most popular ones are run by people who are fuckheads, right? But if politicians actually did want to take on big tech, there are things they could do that wouldn't require censorship, breaking them up by enforcing antitrust laws so that way they're not all owned by a handful of fascist oligarchs, and making them publicly owned would be a fucking start, right? But they don't have interest in doing that because the goal here isn't to actually rein in big tech. The goal is censorship. And we shouldn't allow them to get away with this because age verification is a dangerous road to go down, and we're not going to get the government to give up this new power once they get it. I can assure you of that, which is why we need to stop them before it's too late. So call your representative and tell them to protect civil liberties and reject the Kids Online Safety Act. And this really does need to become a litmus test for Democratic Party politicians going forward, because KOSA isn't going to go away anytime soon. And even if we defeat this one, another version will pop up a year or two down the road. And age verification laws are only getting more popular across the world. The Canadian government just proposed their own age verification bill. So at a time when governments around the world are cracking down on online speech, the left needs to make it very clear that we unequivocally oppose their censorship attempts.